canvas tent flaps in darkness, its seams groaning under October wind, and inside, 17 bodies dressed in sequins and grease paint lie where they fell, frozen mid-performance for 70 years. This is the story of how an entire traveling circus erased itself from American memory, and why their final show might have been their most horrifying act. The evening of October 9th, 1931, began with the smell of roasted peanuts and hay, the creak of wooden wagon wheels settling into soft earth, and the rough bite of canvas as roustabouts hauled the big top skyward just outside Cotter, Arkansas. The Pendleton Brothers Spectacular had rolled into the Ozark foothills with 43 performers, 12 wagons, and a menagerie that included 2 aging Bengal tigers, a trained bear named Jolson, and a quartet of Arabian horses whose coats shimmered under kerosene lamps. Local farmers watched the caravan snake past their properties that afternoon, counting the wagons, waving at the painted faces peering from windows. By dusk, the lot was transformed. 3 performance tents erected in a clearing bordered by dense oak and pine, ticket booth assembled, animal cages positioned in careful rows. The Pendleton brothers were nobody's first choice that autumn. Vaudeville was dying. The Depression had gutted attendance across the heartland, and even the grand circuses, Ringling, Barnum, were consolidating routes, cutting acts. Pendleton limped through backwater towns that larger operations ignored, offering cut-rate admission and performances that blended spectacle with desperation. Their ringmaster, a man named Horace Lyle, had a reputation for taking on performers other circuses rejected: ex-convicts, drifters, a Czech acrobat rumored to have fled Prague under suspicious circumstances. The troupe was a collection of last chances. Cotter itself barely registered as a town. 200 souls, a general store, a Baptist church, and endless timber. The circus had no permit, no advance advertisement. They simply appeared, as traveling shows often did, expecting to draw farmers and their families with nothing but curiosity and a single night's distraction. Before the tents came down, witnesses, and there were exactly 7 who later gave statements to county authorities, described the setup as unremarkable. The Pendleton brothers followed the standard rhythm: raise the big top by 4 p.m., animal feeding at 5:30, performers visible through tent flaps applying makeup and adjusting costumes. A small crowd gathered by 6 p.m. Perhaps 30 locals, mostly children dragging reluctant parents. Tickets cost 15 cents. The show was scheduled for 7:30. It never started. At 7:41 p.m., according to the pocket watch of Martin Ducey, a Cotter feed supplier, the music stopped. Not gradually, not with a flourish, but mid-note. The calliope had been wheezing through a jaunty march when it simply cut silent. Ducey, waiting outside, the big top with his 2 daughters, noticed immediately. So did the others lingering near the entrance. They exchanged glances, waited. 1 minute became 5. A child began crying. Someone called out, asking if the show was delayed. No answer came from inside. Ducey stepped forward, pulled back the tent flap, and peered into the dim interior lit by hanging lanterns. He saw the empty ring, the bleachers with scattered spectators, maybe 20 people, all sitting motionless, staring forward at nothing. The performers were gone. The ringmaster's podium stood abandoned. Even the smell seemed wrong. Not sawdust and popcorn, but something faintly metallic, faintly sour. He called out again, still nothing. Not from the audience inside, not from anyone. Then he noticed the rear tent flap, the one leading to the backstage area, billowing as though someone had just passed through. Ducey walked the perimeter, found the smaller tents dark, the animal cages open and empty, The wagons remained, horses still hitched, but every living soul attached to the Pendleton Brothers Spectacular had evaporated in the span of minutes. By 8 p.m., the remaining townspeople had scattered. By 8:30, the county sheriff arrived to find the lot deserted, except for the structures themselves. Tents sagging in the wind, a half-eaten apple browning on a crate, a single leather boot lying in the grass. The sheriff's report, filed 3 days later and preserved in the Baxter County archives, contains a single haunting line. No evidence of struggle, no evidence of departure, no evidence of presence. The circus had been there. Then it wasn't, but the tents remained standing. Where are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop your location in the comments. I'm curious how far this story travels. And if you want to see where this leads, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened next took 70 years to surface. And when it did, it rewrote everything we thought we knew about that October night. The question nobody asked in 1931, the one that should have been asked, was simple. If the performers vanished, why did the animals vanish with them? And more importantly, where did 43 people go in a region with no roads, no railways, and no witnesses who saw them leave? The answer was waiting in the trees, patient and terrible, for 7 decades. 3 days passed before anyone realized the circus hadn't just left. It had dissolved. Understanding what happened in October 1931 requires grasping how thoroughly a traveling circus could disappear in Depression-era America, and how little anyone cared when it did. Sheriff Raymond Coulter spent October 12th walking the abandoned lot with his deputy, a man named Willis Frome, cataloging what remained. The big top still stood, though its canvas had begun to sag. The smaller tents, dressing areas, animal holding pens, were intact but empty. Wagons sat in formation, their contents undisturbed. Costume trunks, coiled rope, a strong man's barbells, crates of canned beans and hardtack. The calliope rested on its flatbed, keys still depressed as though invisible fingers held them down. Coulter tried cranking the mechanism. It wheezed once, then fell silent. What they didn't find mattered more. No blood, no torn fabric, no scuffed earth suggesting struggle or rapid movement. The animal cages stood open, latches lifted from the inside. A detail Frome noted in his personal diary, though it never appeared in official reports. Who opens a tiger cage from within unless they mean to let something out, or let themselves in? He wrote that night. The townspeople who'd witnessed the setup were interviewed. Their stories aligned too perfectly, which Coulter found suspicious in itself. Circus arrived mid-afternoon, tents raised by dusk, performers visible, animals audible, then silence. When pressed about specifics, what the performers looked like, whether anyone spoke to them, the witnesses grew vague. One farmer claimed he'd sold the circus 3 bushels of apples, but couldn't describe who'd paid him. A woman insisted she'd watched a trapeze artist practice at 5 p.m., but when asked to point out which tent, she gestured toward empty air. They remembered the circus. They couldn't remember the people. By October 15th, Coulter had contacted surrounding counties, sent telegrams to Little Rock, even reached out to the Showman's League of America asking for records on Pendleton Brothers Spectacular. The League's response arrived a week later. No such circus existed in their registry. No permits filed in Arkansas, Missouri, or Oklahoma under that name. No Horace Lyle listed as a registered ringmaster anywhere in the United States. The circus, it seemed, had been as fictional as its disappearance was real. Coulter made one final attempt. He hired a pair of local hunters, men who knew the Ozark woods intimately, to sweep the forest surrounding the lot. If 43 people and a dozen animals had fled into the trees, there would be tracks, broken branches, signs of passage. The hunters returned after 2 days with nothing. The forest bordered the clearing on 3 sides, dense enough to swallow a regiment, but the undergrowth showed no disturbance. It was as though the tree line itself had been a wall the circus couldn't cross, or wouldn't cross. On October 23rd, a teenager named Samuel Oates came forward with a detail he'd been too frightened to share earlier. Samuel had been present that night, sitting on a hay bale near the Big Top's entrance. He'd heard the music stop, watched his father and Martin Ducey investigate, but he'd stayed outside, frozen by something he couldn't name. Just before the adults emerged to declare the performers missing, Samuel saw movement at the forest edge, a figure tall and pale standing between 2 oaks. It wore what looked like a ringmaster's coat, but the proportions were wrong. Too long in the arms, too thin in the frame. Samuel blinked, and it was gone. Coulter dismissed the sighting as a frightened child's imagination, but he noted it nonetheless. When pressed, Samuel added one more detail. It was smiling. I could see that even from 50 feet away. It was smiling like it knew something we didn't. By November, the story had faded from local concern. Coulter filed his final report on November 7, 1931, concluding that the Pendleton Brothers Spectacular had been a con operation that abandoned its equipment to avoid debts. The tents and wagons were auctioned to a salvage company out of Harrison. The lot returned to Wilderness. Cotter moved on, but 3 people didn't move on. Martin Ducey refused to enter the woods south of town for the rest of his life. Willis Frome quit law enforcement in 1933 and moved to Tulsa, telling his wife only that some things ain't meant to be found. And Samuel Oates, who lived until 1998, gave a deathbed interview to his granddaughter in which he claimed he'd seen the figure in the trees 3 more times over the years. Always at dusk, always at the old circus lot, always smiling, always waiting. The question nobody asked Sheriff Coulter because nobody knew to ask it. If the circus was a con, why leave behind everything? The wagons alone were worth hundreds of dollars. The animals, if sold, could have fed a family for months. And the tents, high-quality canvas, professionally stitched, were the most valuable items of all. Con men take the money and run. They don't leave the props behind, unless the props weren't what mattered, unless something else was taken instead. What would you do if you'd been in Cotter that night? Would you have entered the tent to investigate? Or would you have walked away like most of the town did, pretending you'd never seen anything at all? The forest kept its secret through wars, through generations, through the slow transformation of the Ozarks from frontier wilderness to tourist destination. What happens to a mystery when everyone who witnessed it dies is simple. It becomes mythology, and mythology doesn't demand answers. Between 1931 and 2001, the abandoned circus lot underwent the quiet metamorphosis that overtakes all forgotten places. The clearing shrank as saplings reclaimed the edges. The road that had brought the wagons became a deer trail, then disappeared entirely beneath leaf litter and undergrowth. Cotter itself evolved. Population swelled to nearly 1,000 by the 70s, then contracted again as timber jobs vanished. The Baptist church burned in 1967 and was rebuilt a mile south. The general store became a bait shop, then closed. By the turn of the millennium, fewer than 300 people called Cotter home, and most of them had arrived after 1970. Nobody remembered the circus. Nobody talked about it. The story existed only in fragments, a yellowed newspaper clipping in the Baxter County Historical Society archives, Sheriff Coulter's report gathering dust in a courthouse basement, Samuel Oates's granddaughter mentioning it once at a family reunion before being told to stop spinning tall tales. The forest, meanwhile, grew deeper. The Ozark foothills are ancient. Limestone and dolomite ridges worn smooth by 300 million years of erosion. Caves honeycomb the bedrock. Sinkholes open without warning. It's a landscape designed for hiding things. The trees, oak, hickory, shortleaf pine, grow dense enough to block sunlight even at noon. Local hunters know better than to wander off established trails. Search and rescue teams pull lost hikers from the same square mile of woods year after year, disoriented victims swearing they'd been walking in circles despite heading in straight lines. The forest has its own geometry. In June 2001, 3 amateur explorers from Springfield, Missouri, set out to document abandoned structures in the Boston Mountains region of the Ozarks. Their names were Derek Howell, a 28-year-old freelance photographer, Marissa Chen, 31, a graduate student in folklore, and Kyle Brenner, 26, who ran a website dedicated to Forgotten America. They'd spent the previous summer photographing ghost towns and defunct railroads across Arkansas and Missouri, accumulating a modest following online. Their method was simple: cross-reference historical maps with satellite imagery, hike to coordinates where settlements once stood, document what remained. On June 16th, while reviewing topographic maps from the 1930s at the Arkansas State Archives, Chen noticed something unusual. A surveyor's notation on a 1933 map marked a clearing approximately 4 miles south-southeast of Cotter, with the code SLD, standing lot, debris. The notation was circled in red ink with a handwritten margin note: Circus materials, salvage incomplete. Chen showed Howell and Brenner. They searched for additional references and found Sheriff Coulter's report, which provided enough detail to triangulate the location. Satellite imagery from 1999 showed what might be a clearing, though heavy canopy made confirmation impossible. They decided to investigate. The hike began at dawn on June 23rd. They parked at a Forest Service access point 3 miles north of the suspected site and bushwhacked south using GPS and compass bearings. The terrain fought them. Steep grades, dense laurel thickets, creek crossings over moss-slick stones. By noon, they'd covered less than 2 miles. Brenner suggested turning back. Quanta insisted they continue. At 2:17 p.m., Howell stopped mid-step and raised his hand. Through the trees ahead, maybe 60 yards distant, he'd spotted something that didn't belong, a vertical line too straight to be natural. They approached slowly, cameras ready. The clearing emerged like a stage set. The trees formed a near-perfect circle, perhaps 200 feet in diameter, surrounding a space where grass grew waist-high and wildflowers clustered in improbable abundance. At the center stood 3 structures, partially collapsed but unmistakable in purpose. Circus tents, their canvas rotted to gray-black tatters, wooden support poles leaning at drunken angles, guy lines trailing into the weeds like severed veins. Howell took 47 photographs in the first 5 minutes. Chen circled the perimeter, noting details in her field journal. Brenner stood motionless, staring at the largest tent, the big top, and later admitted he'd felt an overwhelming urge to leave immediately, though he couldn't articulate why. Something about the silence. The forest around them teemed with life. Bird song, insect hum, the rustle of small mammals in underbrush. But inside the clearing, nothing made sound. No birds perched on the tent poles. No insects crawled on the rotted canvas. Even the wind seemed to stop at the tree line, as though the clearing existed in a pocket of stillness. Chen approached the big top first, pulling aside a flap of disintegrated fabric. The interior was dim, illuminated only by gaps in the canopy above. She clicked on her flashlight and swept the beam across the space. Then she screamed. Howell and Brenner reached her within seconds. She stood just inside the entrance, flashlight aimed at the center ring, where 17 human skeletons lay scattered across the ground in a rough semicircle. They were clothed, remnants of costumes still clinging to bones, sequined leotards, striped pantaloons, a top hat resting beside a skull. One skeleton wore what appeared to be a ringmaster's coat, its brass buttons intact. Another was tangled in aerial silks, the fabric fused to ribs by decades of moisture and decay. The skeletons weren't posed. They'd fallen where they died, some face down, others on their sides. One slumped against a support pole with arms raised as though warding something off. Near the center, a smaller skeleton, a child perhaps 10 years old, lay curled in a fetal position, still wearing ballet slippers. They'd been there for 70 years. Chen's training took over. She documented positions, took measurements, sketched a rough layout. Howell photographed from every angle, his hands shaking enough that later he'd have to discard half the shots as blurred. Brenner checked the other 2 tents and found more remains. 9 skeletons in the performer's tent, 12 in the animal holding area, though these weren't human. Tiger bones, bear bones, horse skeletons still partially tethered to iron stakes. In total, they counted 41 sets of human remains and evidence of at least 10 animals, all dead where they'd stood or sat or slept on October 9th, 1931. No wounds, no scattered bones, no signs of scavenging despite 7 decades exposed to predators and weather. The bodies had simply stopped, and the forest had left them alone. But here's what made Howell drop his camera and back toward the exit. Every skull faced the same direction. North-northeast, toward the tree line, where the woods grew darkest. And in the dirt before each skeleton, pressed into earth that should have eroded decades ago, were marks. Not footprints, not scratches. Symmetrical indentations, 3 inches across, arranged in pairs. Like something had knelt beside each body. Why would 43 people and their animals die simultaneously with no signs of violence, no evidence of poison, no explanation for collapse? And why would whatever killed them leave perfect circular marks in the soil, marks that survived 70 winters and 70 summers without fading? Chen, Howell, and Brenner had come looking for forgotten history. They'd found something that should have stayed forgotten. 3 people stood in a clearing that shouldn't exist, staring at death that shouldn't have been preserved, and tried to convince themselves there was a rational explanation. The truth is that human minds recoil from certain kinds of wrongness, and what Marissa Chen found in the ringmaster's coat pocket crossed every boundary between possible and obscene. Howell wanted to leave immediately. His photographer's instinct, the same drive that had captured decaying barns and rusted machinery across 6 states, recoiled from the Big Top's interior. He documented crime scenes for a true crime podcast in '99, seen decomposed bodies in abandoned houses. But this felt different. The air tasted metallic. His chest tightened each time he raised the camera. When Chen insisted they needed more documentation before calling authorities, he agreed only because leaving her alone seemed worse. Brenner methodically worked the perimeter, GPS unit in hand, marking coordinates for each structure. His website followers expected precision, and routine helped him avoid looking too closely at what lay inside the tents. He found remnants of the wagon circle, wooden axles rotted to pulp, iron wheel rims half buried in loam, a strongbox containing $83 in coins and bills that crumbled when touched. He also found something else, a ticket booth, collapsed but intact, with rolls of unused tickets still stacked in the cash box. Each ticket was printed with the same information, Pendleton Brothers Spectacular. Admit 1, 15C, and below that, a date, October 9th, 1931, the night they died. Chen approached the investigation with archaeological discipline. She photographed each skeleton from multiple angles, noted positions relative to tent markers, collected fabric samples from costumes. The preservation bothered her most. In standard decomposition, exposed remains should have been scattered by scavengers within weeks, bones bleached and fragmented by weather within years. These skeletons were intact, articulated, as though they'd been sealed, in a vacuum until this morning. The costumes showed rot consistent with 7 decades of humidity, but the bones themselves looked almost fresh. No weathering, no staining from soil contact, no moss or lichen growth. She was documenting the child skeleton when she noticed its hand. The small bones were curved around an object, a wooden ball painted red, about the size of a plum, a juggling prop. Chen carefully photographed it in situ before gently lifting it free. The ball was lightweight, hollow. Something rattled inside. She twisted the hemispheres apart. A piece of paper fell out, folded tight. The note was written in pencil on what appeared to be torn cardstock, the handwriting precise despite evident haste. They came at dusk, said they wanted to see the show. We let them in. God forgive us. We let them in. No signature, no date. But the implication crystallized Chen's unease into something approaching terror. Someone had written that note after the performance was supposed to start, after the audience arrived, after something went wrong. Someone had time to hide a message before they died, before whatever killed them made them kneel. She showed Howell and Brenner. They stood in silence for nearly a minute before Brenner spoke. We need to check the other bodies. They did. Systematically, despite every instinct screaming to run, they examined the remaining skeletons for additional messages, personal effects, anything that might explain the tableau. What they found constructed a narrative more disturbing than sudden death. In the performer's tent, tucked inside a sequined bustier still clinging to ribs, a photograph of a woman and 2 children, the image faded but visible. On the back, written in the same hand as the juggler's note, "For Mama, we tried to run, but the doors wouldn't open." Near the animal cages, wedged between a tiger's vertebrae and the bars, a strip of canvas with charcoal writing, nearly illegible. They look like us, but they smile wrong. And in the ringmaster's coat, the discovery that made Chen pocket her notebook and declare they were done documenting was a leather journal, water-damaged, but readable in sections. The final entry was dated October 9th, 1931, 7:41 p.m. Performance delayed, audience unresponsive. Tried to start the show, but Bennett says the music won't play right. Says the notes come out backward. I went to check, and he's correct. The calliope produces sound, but wrong, like hearing music through water or remembering a song you never learned. Told everyone to wait. Then Constance screamed from backstage. Said she saw them. I asked who. She said, them, they're here, they're all here. I don't understand. The audience is just sitting there. Sitting and smiling. All of them smiling. We didn't sell 40 tickets, but there's 40 people in the stands, and I don't remember their faces, and Marcus says we have to. The entry ended mid-sentence below it, indifferent. Handwriting, shakier, desperate. It's not the audience. It never was. The journal didn't explain what happened. It explained what was happening. Howell broke the silence. "We call the sheriff now. We get out. We call from the truck. We don't come back." Chen agreed. They gathered their equipment, triangulated their exit route, and started for the tree line. That's when Brenner noticed the photographs. Not his photographs. He hadn't taken any Polaroids. But scattered around the clearing's edge, partially buried in leaf litter, were dozens of instant photos, the kind that develop on the spot. He picked one up. It showed the big top, fully erected, lit from within by lanterns. Performers visible through the canvas, shadows moving. The photo quality suggested 1970s or 80s film stock. He found another. Same tent, same angle, but the canvas had sagged, the colors faded. This photo looked newer, maybe 1990s. A third photo showed the clearing as they'd found it today. Collapsed tents, overgrown grass. The timestamp in the corner read June 23, 2001, today's date. But they hadn't taken that photo. Chen grabbed the image from his hand, stared at it, then at the tree line. Someone else is here. They scanned the forest. Nothing moved. No sounds but their own breathing. Howell checked his camera, fully functional. Brenner looked at his GPS. Coordinates stable. Chen examined the photo more closely and noticed something in the corner, barely visible among the trees. A figure, tall and pale, partially obscured by an oak trunk. Smiling. The same figure Samuel Oates had described 70 years earlier. The same impossible proportions. The same sense of wrongness that made the eye slide away from it. Chen flipped the photo over. On the back, in pencil, a single word. Stay. That's when they ran. Not walking quickly, not hurried retreat, but full sprint through underbrush and over fallen logs, compass bearings forgotten, GPS abandoned, every survival instinct overridden by the certainty that remaining in that clearing one more second would cost them something irretrievable. They crashed through laurel thickets, forded the creek without stopping, climbed the steep grade north with lungs burning and legs screaming. They didn't look back, not once, because they could hear it behind them. Not footsteps, not breathing, but the absence of sound that marked the clearing, following them through the forest like a bubble of silence swallowing the world 1 yard at a time. They reached the truck at 4:53 p.m. Howell's hands shook so badly that Brenner had to drive. Chen sat in the back seat, staring at the photos and the journal and the note from the juggling ball, trying to construct a framework that made sense. She couldn't, because the evidence suggested something impossible, that whatever happened on October 9th, 1931, was still happening, that the circus hadn't vanished. It had been frozen, preserved, maintained by something that returned periodically to check on its collection. And now that collection had 3 new visitors who knew where to find it. What would you have done if you'd found those photos? Would you have kept running? Or would the need to understand have dragged you back into that clearing, despite every warning your body screamed? They drove straight to the Baxter County Sheriff's Department, where their story would launch an investigation that answered none of the questions and raised 100 more. Deputy Sheriff Linda Graves had worked Baxter County for 11 years and thought she'd heard every variety of nonsense the Ozarks could produce. What makes a law enforcement officer believe the unbelievable isn't evidence. It's the look in a witness's eyes when they know they sound insane and tell the truth anyway. Chen, Howell, and Brenner arrived at the sheriff's station at 5:32 p.m. on June 23rd, 2001, covered in scratches, clothes torn from their sprint through the forest, and carrying a bag of items that would later be catalogued as evidence in case file BS0147. Graves took their statement in interview room 2, a windowless space with cinder block walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects. She'd expected hikers reporting a poaching site, or maybe human remains from a recent crime. What she got was a story about a circus that died in 1931 and a clearing that shouldn't exist. Her first instinct was dismissal. The Ozarks attracted urban explorers and amateur ghost hunters the way roadkill draws buzzards. People looking for thrills, manufacturing mysteries from mundane decay. But 3 details made her pause. The GPS coordinates were precise and consistent across all 3 witnesses. The photographs they'd brought were genuine period prints, not digital fakes, and the journal entries matched handwriting samples from Sheriff Coulter's original report, which Graves pulled from archives while they waited. The journal was authentic, which meant either they'd stolen it from a historical site or they'd found it exactly where they claimed. Graves called Sheriff Tom Wickham at home. He arrived 20 minutes later, read the statements, examined the evidence, and made a decision that would define the rest of the summer. They'd go back to the clearing at dawn with a full forensic team. The forest would be given one chance to explain itself. The expedition departed at 5:45 a.m. on June 24th. Wickham led with Graves, 2 additional deputies, Marcus Fallon and Janet Reese, a county coroner named Dr. Emil Rostov, and a forensic photographer from Little Rock named Patricia Vance. Chen, Howell, and Brenner came as guides. Though Howell had spent the previous night awake in his motel room, staring at the ceiling, debating whether returning was stupidity or duty. They reached the access point by 6:30 and began the hike south. Chen navigated using the previous day's GPS track, but within a mile she noticed something wrong. The route didn't match. Terrain that had been steep was now level. The creek they'd forded appeared half a mile east of where it should have been. When she mentioned this, Wickham assumed she was disoriented. When Brenner confirmed her observation, tension crept into the group. At 8:17 a.m., they reached the coordinates. The clearing wasn't there. Instead, they found unbroken forest, mature oaks and hickories forming a canopy so dense that ferns carpeted the understory. Exactly the kind of old-growth woodland that takes centuries to establish. No tents, no bones, no evidence that the space had ever been disturbed by human activity. Vance took soil samples. Rostov checked the GPS against topographic maps. Fallon walked expanding circles looking for any sign they were simply offset from the actual location. Nothing. Chen stood at the exact coordinates where she'd photographed skeletons 16 hours earlier and saw only moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. Howell broke the silence. "This is the place. I know it's the place." Graves asked how he could be certain. He pointed to a distinctive rock formation, 3 limestone boulders stacked like cairns, that appeared in his photographs. The formation was here, precisely where it should be, but the clearing around it had vanished, or had never existed. Wickham made them wait while he radioed the station for a surveyor's opinion on the topography. The surveyor confirmed that according to all available records, historical maps, satellite imagery, Forest Service documentation, no clearing had existed at these coordinates since at least 1963, when the first aerial surveys were conducted. Whatever Chen's team had found, it wasn't cataloged in any database. They spent 4 hours searching. Rostov found nothing suggesting recent burial sites. Vance's soil samples showed standard forest composition, with no trace of canvas fibers, metal residue, or calcium phosphate concentrations that would indicate decomposed remains. Reese discovered a game trail that led to a limestone outcrop riddled with small caves, but the caves showed no signs of human use. At 12:40 p.m., Wickham called the search. They hiked back to the vehicles in silence, each person processing the implications differently. Graves believed they'd made a navigational error. Rostov suspected Chen's team had found remains at a different site and conflated locations. Fallon thought they were lying, though he couldn't articulate why 3 people would coordinate such an elaborate hoax. Chen knew they'd been at the right coordinates. The question that paralyzed her was simpler and more terrible. If the clearing could appear and disappear, what controlled when it became visible? And what decided who could see it? Back at the station, Wickham reviewed the evidence again. The journal was authentic. A handwriting analyst confirmed the entries matched. Samples from Horace Lyle, the ringmaster named in Coulter's 1931 report. The photographs showed legitimate period details, tent construction methods, costume styles, even the specific model of calliope visible in one shot. The coins from the strongbox dated to the correct era. Every physical item supported the story. But there was no clearing, no bodies, no circus. On June 26th, Wickham made a decision he later admitted troubled him for years. He closed the case as unfounded. The evidence was filed. The report marked insufficient information to proceed, and Chen's team was told that without a crime scene, there was nothing to investigate. If they wanted to pursue it further, they could submit their findings to academic journals or historical societies. The sheriff's department was done. Chen tried exactly that. She sent detailed reports to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, the Ozark Society, and 3 universities with anthropology programs. 2 never responded. 1 sent a polite rejection, noting that without verifiable coordinates and professional excavation protocols, they couldn't validate the discovery. The 4th, a folklore professor at University of Arkansas, sent a different kind of response. A photocopy of a newspaper article from October 1913 describing a traveling medicine show that vanished near Eureka Springs after a single performance. Below the article, the professor had written, "This happens every 18 to 20 years in the Ozarks. No one knows why. No one can find the sites afterward. Stop looking." Chen called the professor's office. The number was disconnected. The university's directory listed no one by that name in the folklore department. The letter had come from someone who either didn't exist or didn't want to be found. Howell deleted every photograph from the clearing. Not because anyone asked him to, but because each time he looked at them, he noticed new details in the backgrounds. Shapes among the trees that hadn't been visible during the shoot. Shadows that moved between frames despite identical timestamps. He kept one image, the photo they'd found with today's date, the one showing the figure in the trees. He kept it as evidence that he wasn't insane, that something had been there watching them. Brenner shut down his website in August 2001. He told his followers he was pursuing other projects. He didn't mention that he'd started having dreams about the clearing, dreams where he walked among the skeletons, and they turned their skulls to watch him pass. Dreams where the ringmaster's journal wrote itself in real time, and the final entry was always his name. The circus had vanished twice. Once in 1931. Once in 2001. But here's what the sheriff's report didn't include, what Wickham only told Graves years later. On June 28th, 2 days after closing the case, he'd driven back to the coordinates alone. He'd hiked in at dawn, reached the location, and found the clearing exactly as Chen had described. Tents collapsed, skeletons arranged in their horrible semicircle, ticket booth standing like a tombstone. He'd stood there for 10 minutes, staring, trying to decide if he should radio for backup, or if that would require explaining why he'd returned without authorization. While he debated, the light changed. Not sunset. It was barely 7 a.m., but a dimming, as though clouds had covered the sun. Except there were no clouds. The sky was clear. The temperature dropped. His breath misted. And from the tree line, he heard something that made him walk backward to his vehicle without turning around. Humming. Multiple voices, harmonizing, singing a melody he almost recognized but couldn't place. When he reached the truck and looked back, the clearing was gone. Just forest, dense and green and ordinary. He never filed a supplemental report. Never told anyone except Graves. Never went back. Why would a veteran sheriff with 2 decades of experience choose to suppress evidence of a crime scene containing 41 bodies? What does it say about a place when the people sworn to investigate it decide instead to leave it alone? The answer, Wickham told Graves, was simple. Some things enforce their own boundaries. Some mysteries protect themselves. And smart people recognize when they've found something that doesn't want to be solved. But the story doesn't end with official silence and personal terror. It ends with a pattern that stretches back further than 1931. A pattern that suggests the circus was never the first act. A retired librarian named Constance Merrick spent 40 years cataloging Ozark folklore and never published a single finding, because what she discovered suggested the mountains had been feeding on people for centuries. The difference between history and mythology is documentation, and when Marissa Chen received Merrick's journals in the mail 3 months after the clearing vanished, she realized the circus was merely the most recent iteration of something far older. The package arrived in September 2001, forwarded from Chen's university address to her apartment in Springfield. No return address. Inside, 4 leather-bound journals filled with handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps spanning from 1847 to 1998. A brief typewritten letter explained that Merrick had died on August 12, 2001, and her executor, a nephew in Fayetteville, had found Chen's name in his aunt's final correspondence with instructions to send everything if the circus story surfaced again. Merrick had been waiting for someone to find it. The journals were meticulously organized, each entry documenting vanishings across the Ozark region with consistent elements. Groups of people, entertainment or religious gatherings, sudden disappearance, and eventual discovery of remains decades later in locations that couldn't be relocated. The earliest entry dated to June 1847. Traveling theater company, 12 performers last seen near Buffalo River, vanished after single performance. Bodies found by hunters in 1891, 44 years later, still wearing stage costumes, arranged in circle facing inward. Local Cherokee informant told surveyor the place was where the audience sits below ground. White settlers dismissed this as superstition. Chen cross-referenced the Cherokee phrase in linguistic databases and found a partial translation. Not audience below ground, but those who watch from underneath. The distinction mattered. It suggested the ground itself, or something beneath it, was the observer, not the observed. Merrick's journals documented 17 similar incidents between 1847 and 1998. Each followed the same pattern. A traveling group, circus, theater troupe, revival tent, even a Chautauqua lecture series in 1922. would arrive in a rural Ozark community, set up for a single performance, and vanish overnight. No witnesses to departure, no evidence of struggle. Authorities would search, find nothing, close the case. Then, decades later, always between 40 and 70 years, someone would stumble upon the site. The remains would be preserved impossibly well, arranged in deliberate positions, surrounded by evidence suggesting they died mid-performance. And the sites would disappear again within days of discovery. What made Merrick's research extraordinary wasn't just the pattern, it was the maps. She'd plotted every incident on topographic overlays and discovered they formed a rough spiral, starting near the Buffalo River in the west and tightening inward over 150 years toward a center point in northern Baxter County. The Pendleton Brothers Spectacular, vanished in 1931 and found in 2001, fell exactly on the spiral's terminus. The implication was clear. The incidents weren't random. They were deliberate, progressive, moving toward some focal point where the boundary between presence and absence grew thinnest. Chen spent 2 weeks verifying Merrick's sources. Every newspaper clipping checked out. Every death certificate existed. Every police report matched. In October 2001, she drove to Fayetteville to interview Merrick's nephew, a tax attorney named David Hollis, who seemed relieved someone was taking the journals seriously. Hollis explained that his aunt had become obsessed with Ozark vanishings in her 30s after working as a county clerk in Marion County. She'd filed death certificates for a family of 5 whose remains were discovered in 1963. Parents and 3 children found in a collapsed tent near Yellville, dressed in clothes from the 1890s, bodies intact despite 70 years' exposure. The coroner had classified cause of death as undetermined, which Merrick found inadequate. She'd started researching similar cases and never stopped. She went out to the spiral's center point once, Hollis said. 1994, I think. Came back different. Wouldn't talk about what she saw, but she stopped doing field research after that. Just compiled what others sent her. Chen asked where the center point was located. Hollis pulled out a surveyor's map and marked it. A limestone ridge 4 miles south-southeast of Cotter, accessible only by foot, on federal forest land that had never been developed. The exact coordinates where Chen had found the circus. Merrick had known where to look and had chosen not to go back. In November 2001, Chen made a decision that would define the rest of her academic career. She published a paper in the Journal of American Folklore titled Cyclical Vanishings in Ozark Performance Culture, 1847-2001. The paper presented Merrick's findings without speculation, letting the data speak for itself. She included the spiral map, the documented cases, and her own experience finding the circus. She ended with a question. If cultural gatherings in this region vanish on a predictable timeline and reappear in preserved states decades later, what mechanism, natural or otherwise, could account for such consistency? The response was immediate and polarized. Half the folklore community dismissed it as sensationalism, conflating unrelated incidents into artificial patterns. The other half recognized it as the first systematic documentation of a phenomenon that rural communities had whispered about for generations. 3 researchers contacted Chen with additional cases. One, a folklorist from Missouri State, sent records of a gospel revival that vanished near Branson in 1976, 25 years earlier, suggesting another discovery was imminent. But the most significant response came from someone who signed their letter only as WT and postmarked it from Harrison, Arkansas. The letter contained a single paragraph. Constance Merrick asked the right question, but stopped before finding the answer. The spiral doesn't end where you think. It tightens. Each iteration happens faster than the last. 1847 to 1913, 66 years. 1913 to 1931, 18 years. 1931 to 2001, 70 years. But that's the gap between vanishing and discovery. The next vanishing happened in 1998. You should be looking for it now. Chen tried to trace the letter. The postmark was authentic, but the return address, a P.O. box in Harrison, belonged to a closed account. No one named W.T. appeared in regional folklore circles. She considered ignoring it as a hoax until she rechecked Merrick's journals and found a loose page tucked in the back of Volume 4, a page she'd initially missed. The page contained a single entry dated July 1998. Report from Harrison. Traveling Magic. Show 6 performers. Vanished after setup near Lead Hill. Sheriff's Department investigated. Found nothing. Matches pattern. If spiral theory correct, next discovery should occur circa 2038-2040. God help whoever finds them. Merrick had predicted the next cycle and hidden the prediction where only someone looking carefully would see it. Chen sat in her apartment, surrounded by journals and maps and photocopied police reports, trying to process what the pattern meant. If W.T. was correct, if the vanishings were accelerating, then the 40-year gap between incident and discovery might be shortening too. The magic show had disappeared in 1998. It was now 2001. If the acceleration held, the remains might surface within a decade, not 4 decades. And if the spiral was tightening toward a center point, what happened when it finally collapsed? When the iterations came so fast that vanishing and discovery happened simultaneously? When whatever claimed these people no longer bothered hiding its collection? She didn't have answers, but she had coordinates, dates, and a terrible certainty that the circus she'd found wasn't sleeping. It was waiting. Waiting for the spiral to complete. Waiting for the moment when the boundary dissolved entirely and the audience below ground finally revealed itself. What would you do with that knowledge? Publish it and be dismissed as a crank, or keep silent and let others stumble into the pattern unprepared, the way every discoverer before you had done? Chen chose a third option. She kept researching, kept documenting, and waited for someone else to find the magic show. Because if Merrick's prediction held, that discovery would confirm everything or reveal her as a fool. Either way, the answer was coming. The spiral demanded it. The magic show was found on March 14, 2009, by a Boy Scout troop on a wilderness survival exercise. And what they discovered proved Constance Merrick's timeline was accelerating faster than anyone predicted. This is how the pattern ends. Not with answers, but with the recognition that some appetites are patient enough to span centuries and precise enough to announce their schedules. Troop 447 from Mountain Home had camped 2 miles west of Lead Hill, working on orienteering badges under the supervision of Scoutmaster Robert Penner and Assistant Leader Diana Qualls. On their second morning, 3 scouts, Tyler Voss, Marcus Hill, and James Chen, no relation to Marissa, followed a creek upstream during a navigation exercise and found themselves in a clearing they swore hadn't appeared on their topographic maps. The clearing measured roughly 100 feet across, ringed by blackjack oaks that leaned inward as though bowing toward the center. 6 canvas structures stood in various states of collapse. Not circus tents, but smaller pavilions, the kind used by traveling performers who worked intimate crowds. Hand-painted signs still hung from support poles, legible despite weathering. Professor Madrigal's mystifying illusions. See the impossible made real. One night only, the scouts radioed Penner, who arrived with Qualls and the remaining 11 boys. What they found inside the largest pavilion forced Penner to evacuate the troop immediately and call the Boone County Sheriff's Department from the nearest Forest Service road. 6 human skeletons arranged in a star pattern, still dressed in magician's formal wear, surrounded by props that defied decay. The sheriff's response team arrived by 4 p.m. and secured the site. The remains showed the same impossible preservation the circus skeletons had exhibited. Intact articulation, no scavenger damage, costumes rotted, but bones pristine. The props, linking rings, collapsing wands, a small table with hidden compartments, were corroded but structurally sound, as though they'd been stored in a climate-controlled environment rather than exposed to 11 years of Ozark weather. But 2 details separated this discovery from the circus. First, the skeletons weren't positioned as though they'd fallen. They were arranged deliberately, each body placed with geometric precision, arms extended toward the center where a 6th skeleton lay on its back, hands folded across its chest, wearing a top hat and holding a deck of cards fanned across its sternum. Second, the clearing contained something new. A stone marker, roughly 3 feet tall, planted at the exact center of the star formation. The marker was limestone, unweathered, and carved with a single line of text in a language no one on the response team recognized. Photographs were taken and sent to the University of Arkansas Linguistics Department. The response came within hours. The script was a regional Cherokee dialect from the mid-19th century, rarely documented. The translation was approximate but clear. The 9th performance is nearly complete. 9th, not first, not final. 9th. The Boone County investigation lasted 6 weeks. Forensic anthropologists from Arkansas State confirmed the remains dated to approximately 1998, based on costume materials and dental work. Cause of death remained undetermined. No fractures, no chemical traces, no evidence of violence. The bodies had simply stopped. A genealogist traced names from personal effects and confirmed all 6 performers were listed as missing persons from July 1998. Part of a magic troupe that had advertised a single show in Lead Hill before vanishing without a trace. The stone marker became the investigation's central mystery. Geological analysis confirmed the limestone was local to the region, but the carving was fresh. Tool marks showed it had been inscribed within the past 5 to 10 years, not in '98 when the performers died. Someone had returned to the site, found the bodies, and left a message. On April the 21st, 2009, Sheriff Michael Drucker received an anonymous package at his office. Inside, a USB drive containing a single PDF document. The document was 43 pages long and titled The Ozark Performance Cycle, a Complete Documentation. It was authored by Constance Merrick and dated December 1998, 3 years before her death, 7 months after the magic show vanished. The document expanded on Merrick's published journals, but with analysis she'd never made public. She'd identified not 17 vanishings, but 23, with 3 incidents occurring before white settlement based on Cherokee oral histories she'd collected in the 1970s. The 9th performance referenced on the stone wasn't the 9th vanishing. It was the 9th iteration of a cycle that required 12 completions. Each completion corresponded to a specific location along the spiral, each location marking a point where the boundary between worlds grew permeable. The circus had been the 8th performance. The magic show was the 9th. Merrick's document included predictions for the remaining 3. a performance scheduled for 2017 near Eureka Springs, another for 2023 near Jasper, and a final 12th performance for 2028 at the spiral's absolute center, the coordinates where Chen had found the circus. The document ended with a section titled Observations on Mechanism. Merrick wrote, "The pattern suggests intelligence, not natural phenomenon. The performances are selected, not random. They involve entertainment, acts of witnessing, of audience and performer. I believe something beneath the Ozarks feeds on that exchange, that moment when many people focus their attention on a singular spectacle. It consumes that moment, preserving it, and marks the completion with physical evidence that emerges only when the next cycle begins. Each discovery is a preparation for the next vanishing. Each vanishing tightens the spiral. I have seen the center. I will not describe what I found there, only that it is waiting and it is patient, and it has been waiting far longer than white settlement, longer than Cherokee memory, longer perhaps than human presence in these mountains. The 12th performance will not vanish. The 12th performance will open. I will be dead before then. Whoever reads this, do not attend gatherings in the spiral's final location. Do not investigate if performers arrive. Do not become part of the audience. Some shows are not meant for human eyes." Sheriff Drucker forwarded the document to state authorities, to federal investigators, to anyone who might take it seriously. Most dismissed it as elaborate fiction. The FBI field office in Little Rock opened a file and closed it within a month, concluding no federal crimes had been committed. The performers had died of unknown natural causes in 1998. The stone marker was likely placed by the same person who'd sent the document, attempting to create a mystery. But Marissa Chen, who received a copy from a colleague who knew her circus research, recognized the document's authenticity immediately. She cross-referenced Merrick's predictions against historical settlement patterns, geological surveys, and her own field data. The math aligned perfectly. The spiral was real. The cycle was accelerating. And according to Merrick's timeline, updated with the magic show's discovery, the next vanishing would occur in 2017, 8 years away. Chen made one final trip to the Ozarks in June 2009. She hiked to the circus coordinates alone, carrying a GPS unit, camping gear, and a handheld video camera. She found the clearing exactly as she'd seen it in 2001. Collapsed tents, skeletal remains. The terrible silence that marked the place as something other. This time she didn't run. She filmed everything, documenting positions, taking measurements, speaking her observations into the camera in a steady voice that belied her shaking hands. She worked for 2 hours, methodical and thorough, until she noticed something that made her stop mid-sentence. The skeletons had changed positions. Not dramatically. Shifts of inches, alterations in the angle of a skull. A hand that had been palm down, now palm up. She'd photographed them in 2001. She'd memorized their arrangement. And now, 8 years later, they'd moved. They were still performing. Chen left the camera running and backed toward the tree line. As she reached the edge of the clearing, she spoke one final observation into the lens. If Merrick's right, this place is a stage. Everything that happens here is theater for something watching from below. And in 2028, the final curtain rises. I won't be here to see it, but someone will. Someone always does. She never published her footage. She never told anyone what she saw in the forest that day beyond the skeleton movements. She died in a car accident on November 3rd, 2012, on a rural highway near Jasper, one of the predicted performance sites. The accident report noted her vehicle left the road at high speed, despite clear conditions and good visibility, as though she'd swerved to avoid something in the roadway. No obstacles were found. No evidence of mechanical failure. Just a woman driving alone who suddenly veered into a ravine for no apparent reason. Her camera footage was discovered in a storage unit by her sister in 2014 and eventually uploaded to a paranormal research forum, where it gathered thousands of views and equal parts belief and mockery. The footage ends with Chen at the tree line, backing away, and in the final 5 seconds before she shuts off the camera, something appears in frame. A figure standing among the tents, tall and pale, exactly where no one had been moments before. It's smiling, and it's bowing. In March 2017, a small circus called the Holloway Family Performers set up outside Eureka Springs for a weekend engagement. On March 21st, after the first night's show, the entire troupe, 11 performers and 4 support crew, vanished. Their tents remained, their vehicles remained. Local police investigated for 3 weeks and found nothing. The remains haven't been discovered yet. According to Merrick's timeline, they should surface between 2025 and 2027, approximately 40 to 45 years ahead of the original projection, but consistent with the acceleration pattern. Which means whoever finds them will have less than a year before the 12th performance, before the spiral completes. Before whatever has been collecting these moments for centuries finally reveals what it's been building toward. The Boy Scouts who found the magic show are adults now, scattered across the country, trying to forget what they saw in that clearing. Tyler Voss became a park ranger and refuses assignments in the Ozarks. Marcus Hill moved to Seattle and won't discuss his scouting experience. James Chen, whose surname matches Marissa's by pure coincidence, dropped out of college in 2011 and disappeared from public records entirely. Robert Penner, the scoutmaster, still lives in Mountain Home. In a 2020 interview with a local history podcast, he mentioned the incident only briefly, saying, "We found something in those woods that made me understand why some places stay empty. Not because people haven't found them, because something else found them first." And now it's 2025. 3 years until Merrick's final predicted performance. 3 years until something that's been feeding on spectacle and attention, and the moment when many eyes focus on a single stage reaches the end of its century-long spiral. 3 years until we learn whether the pattern ends or transforms into something worse. The coordinates are known. The timeline is established. And somewhere in the Ozarks, at the spiral's absolute center, a clearing waits for its final audience. Local hunters avoid the area. Hikers who stumble near the coordinates report compasses spinning, GPS units failing, and an overwhelming urge to leave immediately. Forest Service rangers have recorded unusual seismic activity. Not earthquakes, but rhythmic vibrations, like footsteps from below, that occur at irregular intervals always at dusk, and sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind dies and the forest holds its breath. People camping in the region report hearing music, faint calliope notes drifting through the trees, playing a tune that sounds almost familiar but comes out wrong, as though remembered from a performance that hasn't happened yet. The circus is still there. The magic show is still there. The theater troupe and the revival tent and all the others are still there, preserved in whatever space exists between presence and absence, waiting for the moment when the boundary collapses and the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th performances happen simultaneously. Merrick was right about one thing. Some shows are not meant for human eyes, but she was wrong about another. The audience isn't optional. The audience was always part of the act. Every person who discovered the remains, every investigator who documented the sites, every researcher who mapped the spiral, they were all buying tickets. We're all buying tickets. The question isn't whether the final performance will happen. The question is whether anyone will be foolish enough to attend. And based on history, based on the pattern of curiosity and hubris that defines how humans approach the unknown, the answer is already written. Someone will go. Someone always does. And when they arrive at that clearing in 2028, when the tents rise and the lights glow and the music begins, they'll finally understand what Konstantin Merrick understood but couldn't articulate. The performances were never about the performers. They were always about the audience. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.